Hey guys, tonight we drift back into Edo, Japan, where the streets are narrow, the houses lean against each other like tired old men, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, soy sauce, and pond water. You find yourself standing on a quiet lane, the hour late, the air damp, and suddenly, there they are, lanterns, hundreds of them. Little glowing orbs carried by men, women, children, even the occasional drunken samurai swaying out of step. They float along the street like a slow river of fireflies. Shadows stretch and bend across wooden shutters, and for a moment, you could swear one of the shadows waves at you before vanishing behind a doorway. You rub your eyes, but the lights keep coming. It's a lantern parade, part festival, part ritual, part late-night excuse for gossip. And if you're not careful, you'll get swept along. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. Edo, after all, is a city where fire is a bigger killer than swords, where ghosts are blamed for stomach aches, and where neighbors peek over fences with all the curiosity of Reddit threads. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing just how wide this sleepy little campfire circle really is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The lanterns are paper, thin and fragile, painted with brush strokes of dragons, flowers, or sometimes the simplest circles. Oil lamps inside sputter, threatening to go out with every gust of night air. And yet, together, they shine enough to make the city seem alive after dark. Without them, Edo nights would be pitch black. There are no neon signs, no buzzing street lamps, no late-night convenience stores, just stars, when the clouds allow, and lanterns. You follow their glow as it winds down a slope, past sake shops where laughter spills out like warm broth, past noodle stands still steaming in the midnight hours, and into the heart of Edo's nightly rhythm. Lantern parades weren't always cheery, though. Sometimes they were linked to funerary rituals or Buddhist ceremonies, guiding souls along their journey. Other times, they were excuses for neighborhoods to flex. Our lanterns are bigger, brighter, shinier than yours. The rivalry could get intense. Picture a block of carpenters trying to outdo a block of fishmongers in lantern style. You'd end up with pufferfish-shaped lanterns bobbing down the street, making you question whether you were at a sacred rite or a comedy sketch. Historians still argue whether these parades leaned more toward community celebration or religious devotion. Were people sincerely trying to honor spirits, or just using lanterns as a socially acceptable excuse to drink after dark? The answer, of course, is probably yes. Both. Humans are complicated like that. The air itself hums with unease. Because in Edo, Japan, nighttime wasn't just the time you sleep. It was a domain of uncertainty, of yokai, the mischievous or sometimes malicious spirits said to lurk just outside the glow of those lanterns. You can imagine it, a child clutching their mother's sleeve a little tighter as a lantern flickers, and a shadow on the wall suddenly looks less like bamboo and more like something with claws. Yet, there's something soothing in the ritual. Everyone moving together, the rhythm of sandals slapping the ground, the warm smell of oil flames mixing with incense. If you've ever been to a candlelight vigil or a Christmas Eve service where the only illumination comes from a sea of tiny flames, you know that oddly calming feeling. Multiply it by 1,000, toss in a healthy dose of superstition, and you've got Edo by lantern light. At the same time, you're aware of how fragile it all is. Every flame is a risk. Edo, with its endless wooden houses packed tight together, was basically one big box of kindling. People lived with the constant anxiety that one overturned lantern could erase an entire district overnight. And indeed, it happened. Fires had nicknames like the Blossoms of Edo. Because they were so common, they became part of the city's seasonal rhythm. Imagine your city burning so often that people casually rank blazes like sports matches. But tonight, you're lucky. No flames are running wild, just a steady, hypnotic parade of paper lanterns, each one casting a gentle halo, each one reassuring you that you're not alone in the darkness. You follow them further, past wooden fences covered in calligraphy, past the faint creak of koto strings from an open window, past the quiet laughter of neighbors who both fear and love these nights. And somewhere, Just beyond the furthest edge of lantern light, you think you glimpse something moving. Was it a dog, a trick of the shadows, or perhaps one of those yokai that storytellers warn about, the kind that lingers just outside the glow, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to step away from the crowd? You take another step, but stay close to the lanterns. Best not to test the shadows tonight. The lanterns guide you down another narrow street, and soon you hear something new, layered over the shuffle of sandals. Drums. Not war drums, not thunderous taiko to rattle your ribs, but the steady, heartbeat-like pulse of festival drums. Edo loves a festival the way modern folks love a 3-day weekend. The city has hundreds, ranging from solemn religious rites to excuses for street food and questionable decisions. Tonight, you stumble into a summer matsuri, where the heat of the day finally loosens its grip, and the night air is filled with smells that make your stomach argue with your sense of dignity. A stall is roasting river eel on skewers. Another has sweet red bean cakes, sticky and steaming, like a soft pillow you can actually eat. Children chase each other with toy masks, some shaped like foxes, others like demons, their painted grins glowing eerily in lantern light. And yes, you wonder if you could pull off one of those masks at your next Zoom call. Probably not. What makes these festivals magical is the blend of the living and the spectral. Lanterns dangle from strings above you, their light painting everything in a soft orange haze. They sway with the breeze like little ghosts. Some lanterns are painted with flowers, others with fierce gods, and a few, cheeky ones, carry yokai faces, their paper tongues hanging out in laughter. You can't decide if they're supposed to scare spirits away or invite them in. Historians still argue whether such lantern art was meant as protective talismans or as good-humored mischief from the festival crowd. A storyteller sets up at the edge of the parade route, calling children closer with a fan that flicks open dramatically. He doesn't need a microphone. His voice carries through the stillness of the night, weaving tales of old. He tells of the kasa obake, the umbrella yokai that hops on one leg, sticks out a long tongue, and surprises the careless on rainy nights. A child squeals in laughter, but then checks the sky nervously, just in case a forgotten umbrella sprouts an eye and decides to follow them home. You glance at the adults nearby and notice how they too lean in when the stories begin. Because festivals aren't just for children, they are moments when the whole neighborhood bonds, where joy and dread mingle like sake poured too generously. The music grows louder as you approach the festival's heart. Dancers whirl in circles, their movements precise yet relaxed, kimono sleeves fluttering like wings in the glow of 1,000 lanterns. You realize it's not just about entertainment, it's ritual. Many summer festivals are tied to Obon, the Buddhist season of welcoming ancestral spirits home for a brief visit. That's the official explanation anyway. The unofficial one is that Edo citizens loved any excuse to dance until midnight and sell fried squid on sticks. Again, both answers are true. Still, there's something uncanny about it. The line between honoring ancestors and summoning something less friendly feels thin. After all, if your beloved grandma can find her way home through the lantern light, so could that neighbor you really didn't get along with. You know, the one who borrowed your rake in 1712 and never gave it back. Maybe he's lurking just behind you now, arms crossed, unimpressed with your festival dance skills. The crowd laughs, the drums roll, and the lanterns bob as though alive. At one stall, a painter is offering quick sketches of yokai. You see a child proudly holding a paper of a grinning kappa, a turtle-like river demon said to lurk in streams and pull people underwater. But in the sketch, it looks less terrifying and more like a sulky pet begging for cucumbers, which incidentally was the kappa's favorite snack. It's a reminder of how yokai stories often bounce between fright and comedy, the way we now tell ghost stories at sleepovers, but can't quite decide whether to shiver or giggle. As the night deepens, the festival doesn't quiet, it thickens. More food stalls open, more lanterns are lit. The drums become faster, and the air grows warmer despite the cool breeze off the river. A samurai passes by, his face serious, but even he carries a small lantern with a painted chrysanthemum, proof that even the stoic warrior class can't resist the glow of a summer night. And here's a quirky tidbit. Not all lanterns were carried by hand. Wealthy merchants sometimes paraded with elaborate lantern floats, multi-tiered constructions shaped like castles or dragons. Imagine dozens of paper scales, each glowing with a tiny flame, moving like a living creature down the street. Some accounts say these floats were so big, they needed teams of men just to turn corners. You picture the chaos when two floats from rival neighborhoods tried to squeeze through the same alley, probably the Edo version of a traffic jam. Historians still debate whether these extravagant floats were primarily status symbols or genuine offerings to the gods. What's clear is that for ordinary folks like you, standing there with a skewer of squid in one hand and a paper fan in the other, it was spectacle. It was color and sound in a world that by day was more rigid and hierarchical. At night, under the lanterns, everyone looked the same, faces lit in orange glow, eyes reflecting flame. You pause at the edge of the dancing circle, watching the motions repeat over and over, hypnotic in their simplicity. Lanterns float above, lanterns circle around, lanterns carried by every hand. It feels almost too perfect, too uniform. And that's when you notice, out of the corner of your eye, a figure dancing without a lantern. Just a shadow moving in step with the rest. When you turn to look directly, of course, nothing's there. Just more light, more laughter, more food smells. Still, you can't shake the feeling that in Edo festivals, it wasn't only the living who showed up to enjoy themselves. You drift along with the parade, still chewing the last bite of eel, when an older man beside you begins explaining how these glowing rivers of light began. He talks as if you already know, but of course, you're just a time traveler tourist in wooden sandals. The man gestures to the lanterns and says they aren't merely for decoration. They carry echoes of Buddhist rites. In earlier centuries, monks floated lanterns down rivers to guide wandering souls, easing them away from the world of the living. Over time, that ritual slipped from temple courtyards into city streets, reshaped by merchants, artisans, and everyday folk who liked the idea of lighting up the darkness, but weren't going to skip a party to do it. And so the Edo Lantern Parade was born, not from a single decree or festival law, but from a patchwork of habits. A bit of temple ritual here, a dash of neighborhood pride there, and of course, the universal human love of showing off a really nice light fixture. Historians still argue whether the earliest parades were meant to guide the spirits of the dead or simply impress rival districts. You can imagine both scenarios. One group of neighbors solemnly intoning prayers, the other across the street bragging, "Well, our lantern has gold trim, so clearly the gods will prefer us." The materials were simple, but deceptively clever. Bamboo made the frame, light, flexible, and cheap. Washi paper stretched over it, translucent and tough enough to survive a night of parade mishaps. Oil, usually rapeseed oil, fed the tiny flame inside. And because Edo was a city obsessed with aesthetics, the lanterns were never just plain. Someone painted pine branches for longevity, another painted a crane for luck, and someone else got carried away and painted what looks suspiciously like their pet cat. Cats, by the way, had their own yokai legends, including the Bakaneko, a supernatural cat with a split tail that could impersonate humans. So yes, even your adorable tabby might have been viewed with a little suspicion if it stared too long into the lantern glow. What's fascinating is how these parades also mirrored the city's geography. Edo wasn't laid out with wide boulevards like Paris. It was a patchwork of districts, alleys, and rivers. So when a parade snaked through, it carried the mood of that neighborhood with it. In merchant quarters, the lanterns might boast bold shop symbols, advertising disguised as piety. In samurai areas, they'd be more restrained, dignified, even austere. You can picture a stern warrior frowning at a lantern shaped like a pufferfish. Not very intimidating. Yet, despite those differences, lantern parades gave Edo a sense of shared rhythm. Night after night, block after block, the city pulsed with this breathing glow. Imagine it, walking from one district into another, lantern styles shifting like dialects of light. Some carried tall cylindrical shapes, others squat globes, still others multi-layered designs that looked like miniature pagodas. To walk through Edo at night was to move through a gallery of portable art. There's a quirky tidbit about the origins, too. Some scholars argue that lantern parades drew inspiration from an even older Chinese practice, where lanterns symbolized hope for fertility and prosperity. Imported ideas often traveled along with trade goods like silk and porcelain. Edo people took the foreign idea, reshaped it, and added their own twist. Literally, in the case of spiral lanterns, designed to ward off evil spirits with dizzying patterns. Were they genuinely effective? Hard to say. Historians still argue whether people truly believed the lantern spirals confused yokai, or whether it was just a fun excuse to design something flashy. The irony is that lanterns were both practical and symbolic. They lit your way to the rice shop after dark, yes, but they also represented the fragile line between order and chaos. A lantern flame could protect you from stumbling into a ditch, or, if dropped, could set half the ward ablaze. Light was life, but it was also danger. And so, each parade carried that duality, joy and unease walking hand in hand. As you stroll with the crowd, you notice how lanterns aren't just carried, they're also displayed. Some hang from wooden posts in front of houses, each one glowing like a personal welcome sign. Others dangle in clusters from shrines, bathing the carved wooden gates in warmth. A particularly impressive one sits high on a pole, painted with a grinning tengu, the long-nosed goblin famous for its arrogance. People chuckle as they pass, some bowing slightly, others muttering prayers, just in case the tengu is paying attention. Because the one thing you never do in Edo, never, is assume that spirits aren't listening. There's another layer to the origin story, and it's almost comical. Lantern parades also became ways for neighborhoods to manage security. Think about it, a group of people walking together with lights made for safer streets. It discouraged thieves, and it made the city feel watched. It's like an Edo version of a neighborhood watch program, except instead of reflective vests, you get paper lanterns painted with dancing skeletons. Of course, whether the parades really made the city safer is still debated. Some scholars claim they worked more like deterrents. Ghosts and burglars both dislike bright lights. Others argue the opposite. Lantern parades drew crowds, which drew pickpockets, which meant you had better keep one hand on your purse while admiring the lantern art. You suspect both are true, because human nature hasn't changed much in 400 years. You pause to breathe in the air, thick with smoke, oil, incense, and the faint musk of too many bodies crowded together. The lanterns sway, and the parade rolls on, glowing like a river of fire across the wooden city. Somewhere behind you, someone's lantern goes out, and there's a little gasp, followed by nervous laughter. They quickly relight it, but not before an old woman whispers that letting your lantern die in the middle of the parade is unlucky. You wonder if she's serious, or just messing with the youngsters. Hard to tell. People in Edo enjoyed their superstitions the way modern folks enjoy conspiracy podcasts, equal parts fear and entertainment. And so, step by step, lantern by lantern, you're walking not just through a city, but through centuries of layered meaning. Each flame is a memory of Buddhist prayers, a nod to Chinese traditions, a neighborhood's pride, and a warning that in Edo, night is never just night. It's a stage, lit by fragile paper suns, where the living and the dead both have roles to play. The lanterns keep swaying, casting orange halos onto the damp ground, and as you move along with the parade, you can't help but wonder what lurks just beyond that circle of glow. Because this is Edo, and every flicker of light comes with a shadow. Shadows filled with creatures your guidebooks would never dare to print. Yokai, spirits, tricksters, things that make you pause at a dark alley and suddenly remember an urgent appointment somewhere very far away. The first one you see, or at least think you see, is a flicker of movement at the corner of your eye. You turn quickly and spot nothing, just a wooden shutter closed tight. But the old woman walking next to you chuckles knowingly and mutters about the zashiki warashi, the childlike yokai who sneaks into houses. Supposedly, if you hear tiny footsteps at night and no child lives with you, congratulations. You've just been adopted by a ghost kid. Strangely enough, zashiki warashi weren't feared so much as welcomed. They were considered bringers of good fortune, which makes you wonder how many Edo merchants secretly hoped to hear phantom giggles while counting their coins. But not all yokai were so generous. Just beyond the lantern light, you imagine the kappa waiting in the canals, those turtle-like water goblins with dish-shaped heads that had to stay wet to keep them alive. Parents would warn children not to play near rivers at night, lest a kappa pull them under. But here's the quirky bit. Kappas were also said to be polite to a fault. If you bowed deeply enough, they'd feel obligated to bow back, spilling the water from their heads and losing their strength. Imagine surviving an encounter with a river demon by outmannersing it. Historians still argue whether these tales were really meant as moral lessons about courtesy or simply ways to keep kids from drowning while chasing frogs after dark. Another lantern wobbles in the night breeze, and for a moment its shadow on the wall looks suspiciously like a giant, drooping tongue. You think of the Rokurokubi, the woman yokai whose neck stretches impossibly long while her head drifts around corners in the dark. The stories say that by day, she looked like any ordinary woman, but at night, her body snored in bed while her head floated off to spy on neighbors. You chuckle quietly, imagining the Edo equivalent of a neighborhood gossip, except instead of eavesdropping through thin walls, her head literally popped over your garden fence. The scholars of today debate whether such tales reflected anxieties about women's hidden lives, or if it was simply another excuse to frighten apprentices who stayed out too late. The parade carries you past an old wooden bridge, lantern light rippling on the water below. Here, people whisper about ghosts of the drowned, especially women in white kimono whose sleeves billow like underwater wings. These spirits, called yurei, are said to follow you if you meet their gaze, trailing you silently until dawn. You glance down, careful not to make eye contact with the water, and quicken your step just a little. After all, superstition has a way of becoming very persuasive when you're walking alone at midnight. Children cling tighter to their parents as the parade winds past another alley. Someone whispers about the Nurikabe, the invisible wall yokai that appears suddenly in your path, blocking your way no matter which direction you turn. If you've ever wandered drunk through a city and sworn the street moved, congratulations, you and Edo's yokai lore are on the same wavelength. The curious thing is how often yokai blur the line between fear and humor. They frighten you, yes, but they also entertain. They're the ghost stories that keep you awake and the jokes that help you sleep. Take the Kasa Obake, the umbrella yokai with one eye, one leg, and an overly long tongue. Nobody knows if anyone ever truly believed in it, or if it was just Edo's way of poking fun at old household objects. Be careful, someone might joke. If you neglect that umbrella in the corner too long, it might sprout legs and come looking for you. Historians still argue whether such tales were invented as warnings about wastefulness, an Edo version of recycling propaganda, or simply as carnival-like fun. And of course, some yokai were more symbolic. The Karakasa lantern ghost, for instance, was said to come alive after years of faithful service. It wobbled down the street on one leg, glaring with its single eye. For a city where everything was built of wood and paper, where possessions were fragile and precious, the idea that even your lantern might have feelings wasn't so far-fetched. Objects in Edo weren't disposable. They carried memory, spirit, and, if left neglected, maybe a grudge. You walk deeper into the night, the lantern still glowing, but the darkness between them seems thicker now. Every face you glimpse could be a mask. Every whisper might be laughter, or it might be something else. And yet, it's oddly soothing. Because yokai, for all their tricks and terrors, give shape to the unknown. They explain the creak of a floorboard, the ripple on a canal, the shadow that doesn't quite look right. And isn't that what humans have always done? Spin stories to calm ourselves, even as we shiver under the blankets. You keep close to the lanterns. They're fragile, yes, but they're your shield, your excuse to keep walking. Somewhere out there, beyond the glow, a kappa waits in the river. A rokurokubi peeks over the eaves, and a nurikabe laughs silently at lost wanderers. But here, in the warmth of the parade, you're safe. At least, until a lantern ahead flickers and goes out, leaving a pocket of pure darkness just a few steps away. The pocket of darkness ahead makes you hesitate, but then someone relights the lantern, and the glow blooms back into life, fragile and comforting. You breathe easier and step forward. For all their eerie associations, lanterns were, above all, tools, handmade objects that tied entire communities together. Tonight, you decide to pay attention not just to their glow, but to what they're made of, how they flicker, and how much quiet labor went into each one. Picture the process: a thin skeleton of bamboo, shaved and bent into hoops, carefully tied with slender strips until the frame takes shape. Edo carpenters were experts at coaxing curves out of stubborn wood. Then came the washi paper, handmade from mulberry bark, layered and pressed until it was soft but sturdy. When stretched across the frame, it glowed like a moon when the flame inside was lit. That soft translucence was prized. Too thick, and the lantern smothered the flame. Too thin, and the first breeze tore it apart. The oil was just as important. Most households used rapeseed oil, though whale oil, smoky and pungent, sometimes filled the lamps of wealthier families. You wrinkle your nose at the thought. Imagine trying to enjoy your midnight stroll while smelling faintly of roasted fish. Some records suggest sesame oil was also used, lending a faintly nutty aroma to the streets. Historians still argue whether lantern oil had symbolic meaning beyond simple utility, with some suggesting it represented purity and endurance. Or maybe, more realistically, people just used whatever burned cheapest. Then came the artistry. Lanterns weren't left plain. They were painted with everything from calligraphic shop names to sprawling landscapes. Some families favored crests, turning their lanterns into glowing billboards. Others painted protective charms like stylized eyes to watch the road ahead. And occasionally, you'd spot a truly whimsical creation, a lantern shaped like a carp, or even like a squat little demon, tongue-lolling, daring the darkness to step closer. Idwats had a mischievous streak, and even in ritual, they couldn't resist adding humor. There's a curious belief tied to this craft. Old lanterns, if left unused for too long, might transform into tsukumogami, household objects that gain spirits after 100 years. That umbrella yokai you met earlier, hopping along on one leg? Same category. It makes you think twice about throwing away a busted lamp. What if, after years of service, it was just waiting for someone to light it again? Still, lanterns were fragile, and Edo was nothing, if not a city of fire hazards. People carried little fireproof buckets of water outside their homes, always ready in case of an accident. Entire neighborhoods trained in fire drills, knowing that one toppled lantern could erase their lives in minutes. That's why certain festivals banned open flames, replacing oil lamps with glowing paper filled with fireflies instead. Yes, actual fireflies. Imagine carrying a lantern, not lit by flame, but by a cloud of living, blinking insects. It sounds magical, and also slightly impractical. Historians still debate whether these firefly lanterns were widespread or more of a poetic ideal, described in haiku rather than daily life. As you walk, you notice a vendor repairing a lantern right there on the street. He uses a tiny pot of glue, made from rice starch, patching tears as casually as someone fixing a shoelace. Lanterns were too valuable to throw away after one night. They were patched, repainted, reused. The glow you see now might have shone on 10 festivals before, bearing the fingerprints of countless hands. There's comfort in that, light as a shared inheritance. One more curious detail. Not all lanterns were meant to be carried. Some were stationary, designed to hang outside inns, temples, or bathhouses. These often grew enormous, big enough to require several men just to hoist them into place. Imagine staggering under a paper globe taller than you are, praying the wind doesn't pick up. When lit, they became landmarks, soft beacons in the dark maze of Edo's streets. Meet me under the carp lantern, someone might say, and you'd know exactly where to go. Of course, size came with risks. A gust of wind, a slip of rope, and suddenly you had a flaming paper boulder tumbling into a crowd. Edo fire brigades, called hakishi, dreaded festivals for this very reason. And yet, despite the danger, the lanterns kept growing bigger, brighter, more elaborate, because no one wanted to be outshone. You can almost hear the merchant bragging, "Yes, our lantern collapsed and nearly destroyed the noodle shop, but did you see how magnificent it was?" You pause by a stall selling tiny pocket-sized lanterns, miniatures with collapsible bamboo frames designed to fold into a sleeve during the day. They remind you faintly of camping flashlights, except far prettier. Edo people carried them on night walks, snapping them open like glowing origami. The soft click of bamboo joints was almost as reassuring as the light itself. One man shows you his lantern, boasting that it's painted with charms against fox spirits. Foxes, or kitsune, were notorious tricksters, known for luring travelers off the path. With this lantern, he says, no fox could fool him. You wonder how many travelers swore by such charms, and how many still woke up in the wrong village after a night of heavy drinking. Superstition only carried you so far. Still, the glow of these lanterns feels like armor. Paper, bamboo, and oil may be fragile, but together they weave protection against the endless night. You notice your own steps growing lighter, your breath easier. The fear of yokai feels less sharp when you're wrapped in this warm, swaying light. Perhaps that's why Ed Waits poured such care into lantern making, not just for beauty, not just for ritual, but for reassurance. Every brushstroke, every bamboo hoop, every drop of oil was a promise. You are not alone in the dark. And yet, as the parade turns a corner, you notice a house window where no lantern burns. Just darkness, still and heavy, as if the occupants either forgot or deliberately refused to light one. The crowd seems to avoid that spot, flowing around it like water around a rock. Someone mutters a name under their breath, too low for you to catch, but the tone is uneasy. Whatever dwells in that shadow, you decide not to investigate tonight. Better to stay in the warmth, under the fragile guardianship of paper, oil, and flame. The lanterns sway ahead, casting trembling shadows on the packed dirt road, and you realize something strange. Even though the parade feels cheerful, even festive, the air itself grows heavier. The chatter softens, the pace slows, and suddenly you are passing through a part of Edo, known less for markets and more for stories. Ghost stories, whispered after dark when the wind rattled shutters. These nightly tales, you quickly learn, are almost as essential to Edo nightlife as the lanterns themselves. Imagine yourself at a gathering, the air thick with the scent of grilled fish and the faint sharpness of sake. The lanterns have been doused to a dim glow, and everyone leans in, faces lit from below like masks at a haunted carnival. Someone clears their throat, then begins a kaiden, a ghost story. The rules are simple. Each tale is short, sharp, and unsettling. The more ordinary the setup, the more frightening the twist. One moment, you're hearing about a dutiful wife washing rice by the river. The next, her reflection in the water rises up and refuses to let go. Edo people adored these tales, partly because life was full of sudden ends. Fires, disease, hunger, all reminders that the thin paper walls of your home offered little safety. Ghost stories gave shape to those fears. You could laugh nervously, pretend it was just entertainment, then sleep a little lighter, knowing the chill in your bones was shared by everyone around you. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were meant as genuine rituals of fear or simply cheap thrills for bored townsfolk. The truth, as usual, is probably both. One of the most famous gatherings was Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai, the 100 ghost stories. It was less a party game and more a dare. Here's how it worked. People would gather in a dark room, set up 100 little candles, and after each tale, one candle would be blown out. With every extinguished flame, the shadows grew longer, the silence heavier. The game wasn't truly finished until the last flame died, and you were left in total darkness. Supposedly, when that final light went out, something would come, some yokai, some ghost, called by your reckless invitation. Most groups, unsurprisingly, never made it past the 90th story. You probably wouldn't either. As you walk with the lantern parade, someone near you begins retelling one of these kaiden. Their voice carries, steady and low, and the crowd hushes to listen. The tale is about an abandoned temple where a monk once lived. By day, nothing seemed unusual. But at night, the lantern light revealed that the monk's shadow did not match his movements. It lagged a second behind. Eventually, one evening, the shadow simply stayed in place, watching him. He fled, never to return. And here's the kicker. No one knows whether the temple was ever truly empty again. The house beside you creaks just as the punchline lands, and you feel a small, involuntary shiver crawl up your neck. But ghost stories weren't all solemn. Some carried a wicked humor, poking fun at human folly. You hear one about a stingy merchant who refused to give offerings at the shrine. After he died, his ghost returned every night, not to terrify, but to count coins that no longer existed. The punchline, the neighbors charged admission for people to watch him, turning the haunting into a business. Edo society loved irony almost as much as it loved fear. There's another detail worth savoring. Ghost stories weren't confined to the poor. Samurai households told them too, with slightly different flavors. While commoner tales were filled with shopkeepers and servants, Samurai Kaiden often featured warriors betrayed by rivals or spirits haunting old battlefields. One of the most retold involved a samurai who killed an enemy in secret, only to hear footsteps following him home each night. At first, he dismissed it as nerves, until one evening, his own sandals appeared beside his bed, wet with blood. Was it his guilt, or the victim returned? Historians still debate whether these stories reflected moral teaching, don't dishonor yourself or else, or if they were simply macabre entertainment for men too proud to admit they enjoyed being scared. What ties them all together, though, is setting. Lantern light was always central. A kaiden without a swaying flame felt incomplete. The flicker of paper and oil wasn't just atmosphere, it was the threshold between the living and the unseen. When the flame bent, when shadows lengthened unnaturally, that was when listeners leaned forward. Ed Watts believed the world blurred at the edges, and fire made that blur visible. You pause by a tea shop, where a group has set up an impromptu storytelling corner. One performer, with exaggerated gestures, tells of a woman who visited her friend every night, carrying a lantern with a painted peony. One evening, a curious neighbor followed her home. The trail ended at the graveyard. The next morning, only the lantern remained, its paper damp with dew, its flower wilting. The crowd sighs, some chuckle nervously, and you tighten your grip on your own lantern. Another performer follows with a lighter tale about a fisherman who swore he'd caught a mermaid. But when he proudly displayed it, the lantern glow revealed it was just a soggy old kimono wrapped around driftwood. The punchline lands with laughter, and you realize not every ghost story is meant to chill. Some are simply there to remind you how foolish humans can be in the dark. Still, as the night deepens, the stories lean darker. A hush falls when an old woman begins to speak. Her voice is raspy, like gravel rubbed together, and she tells of a yokai that slips into lantern parades, carrying a light just like yours. It moves among the crowd, smiling, blending in. But if you look closely, its lantern flame burns blue, and its shadow moves differently than everyone else's. By the time you notice, it's too late. You've already followed it away from the group. The crowd nods gravely. The old woman smiles. Then, just as quickly, she starts selling roasted chestnuts as though nothing happened. Edo life never wasted a crowd. That balance, fear, humor, commerce, was the heartbeat of nightly storytelling. The lanterns weren't just decoration, they were stage lights. And as you walk further into the night, you understand something essential. The ghost stories weren't just about yokai, they were about people, about sharing fear in a way that made it bearable, even entertaining. About reminding one another that though the world was fragile, you weren't alone in it. Of course, none of this makes you feel better when your lantern suddenly flickers. The flame dances blue for just a heartbeat. You freeze. The person beside you notices too, then shakes their head. "Bad oil," they mutter. You laugh, perhaps a little too quickly. Bad oil, right? That's all. The lantern parade presses onward, but you notice a shift. The chatter grows thin, the jokes fewer, and the night air thickens like honey. This is the time when yokai aren't just told about in stories, they're expected. Edo folklore brims with them, creatures woven from fear, superstition, and, occasionally, satire. If ghosts reminded you of death, yokai reminded you of the strange unpredictability of life. You quickly learn that in this city, the two were never far apart. The first to be whispered about tonight is the Hitotsume Kozo, the one-eyed boy. Imagine a child, bald-headed, clad in a monk's robe, but with only one enormous eye in the middle of his face. He isn't particularly harmful, more of a trickster than a monster. He startles priests, rattles temple doors, and sometimes scolds people for being impolite. Historians still argue whether he was meant as a warning for real monks who failed their duties, or simply as comic relief in an otherwise terrifying folklore landscape. Either way, he'd probably just scold you for forgetting to take off your shoes before stepping inside. Then comes the Noperabo, the faceless ghost. You hear whispers of her as you pass a darkened alley. At first, she appears ordinary, a woman by a riverbank or a traveler on the road. She greets you politely, but when you lean closer, Her face is smooth as an eggshell. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. The tale spreads quickly through the crowd, and you notice a few people laughing nervously while tightening their grip on their lantern poles. The Nopara bow doesn't harm. She terrifies by reminding you that recognition is fragile. You think you know someone until suddenly you don't. There's laughter again when someone mimics the Karakasa Obake, the umbrella ghost. In Edo, even discarded objects could sprout spirits if neglected too long. Old sandals became hopping demons, broken tea kettles grew legs. And umbrellas? They turned into one-eyed, long-tongued creatures that hopped around on a single handle. It's absurd, of course, but also a sly moral. Treat your belongings with care, or they might return for revenge. One merchant in the crowd jokes that his old ledger might rise up to demand repayment. Everyone chuckles, though you suspect at least half of them are thinking about that broken tool they left in the corner of the shed. But not all yokai are playful. Some are darker, feeding on loneliness or resentment. A woman begins to describe the Ubum, the ghost of a mother who died in childbirth. By lantern glow, she appears on rainy nights, cradling a baby and begging strangers to hold it. At first, you feel pity, but the horror comes later, because once you take the child, it grows heavier and heavier until it crushes you, or vanishes, leaving only wet cloth in your arms. The crowd grows silent, except for one man who mutters that he once heard the baby wasn't deadly at all, merely unbearable, weighing you down with grief rather than flesh. Scholars still debate whether the Ubum is a warning about maternal mortality or a reminder of society's unease with women who died unfinished. Either way, you catch yourself scanning the alleys for the faint cry of a child. A sudden shout from a group of children pulls you back. They're acting out the tale of the Tengu, those long-nosed, red-faced tricksters of the mountains. Once feared as spirits that lured monks astray, by the Edo period, Tengu had softened into something closer to mischievous pranksters. They swooped down from the trees, stole hats, or made travelers lose their way. Samurai sometimes insisted Tengu train them in swordplay, though whether they were boasting or excusing strange behavior is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether Tengu were meant as cautionary figures against arrogance, or simply as folklore's way of mocking authority. You watch the children strut with long sticks pretending to be noses, and you can't help but laugh. It's hard to fear a Tengu when it looks like an overeager kid in a parade mask. The parade continues, but the names come faster now, like an endless roll call of the uncanny. There's the Rokurokubi, women whose necks stretched impossibly long at night, drifting through walls to spy on neighbors. There's the Gashadokuro, a giant skeleton said to be born from the bones of the starved, clattering through villages to drink blood. You're reassured briefly when someone laughs and insists no skeleton bigger than a house could sneak around quietly. But then again, Edo streets weren't exactly well lit. Someone near you retells a stranger tale about a yokai shaped like nothing more than a flame. It hovered near rivers, a pale blue fireball, whispering in a voice you almost, but not quite, recognized. Sometimes it lured you close. Sometimes it simply bobbed along, a reminder that even light itself couldn't always be trusted. The lantern flame in your hand trembles, and you decide not to look at it too closely. You notice something peculiar as you walk. Everyone seems to have a favorite yokai, claimed almost like a neighborhood mascot. Some delight in the umbrella ghost, others lean into the terror of the faceless woman. It's as though the city has divided its fears into categories, and people select whichever one suits their humor or their nightmares. One man mutters that he prefers the Karakasa, because at least an umbrella yokai won't eat you. A woman replies that he clearly hasn't seen enough bad weather. And then, of course, there is the Oni, the horned demons of Japan. Though not strictly yokai in Edo classification, they slip into the stories anyway. Enormous, club-wielding, terrifying. Yet, even Oni could be softened with humor. Children wore paper masks of Oni faces during festivals, gleefully throwing beans at them to drive them out. Oni wa soto, fuku wa uchi. Demons out, fortune in, they cried. Even terror could be ritualized into play. As the parade snakes through narrow lanes, you feel the yokai pressing in from every side. Not literally, but in memory, in imagination. They aren't confined to stories. They seep into how people treat objects, how they respect the dead, how they walk at night. In Edo, you realize fear was communal, not isolating. People joked about it, traded it, performed it, until it became part of the rhythm of city life. Still, as you glance at the paper lantern in your hand, you can't help wondering, if every object has the potential to grow a spirit, what about this very lantern? It flickers, sighs in the night air, and for just a heartbeat, you swear it moves a little closer to your face than you intended. You laugh it off like everyone else, but you don't let go of the pole. You keep walking with the crowd, though your steps feel slower now, as if the night air itself has become heavier. The lanterns sway ahead of you, glowing soft yellow in the darkness, and the shadows between them grow longer, more suggestive. You start to realize something unsettling. The stories people are telling tonight are not all alike. Some come from kabuki plays, others from woodblock prints, still others whispered tales from the countryside. And just like that, you've stumbled into the truth that makes Edo so fascinating. The yokai themselves are unstable, shape-shifting not just in body, but in meaning. One moment you're hearing about the yurei, the traditional Japanese ghost with trailing white robes and long black hair. In the next, you hear of a completely different version, sometimes a tragic figure, other times vengeful, and still other times almost comedic. Historians still argue whether yurei should be seen as a unified category of spirit or just a messy bundle of tales loosely tied together. In a city where theater and publishing exploded, the boundaries between story and belief blurred faster than your eyes trying to follow a moth's zigzag flight. Take the case of the Oiwa story, one of Edo's most famous ghost legends. In one telling, Oiwa is the wronged wife of a scheming samurai. Poisoned by face cream that disfigured her, she dies and returns to haunt him, her lantern-lit visage twisted and horrifying. In another version, the details shift. Sometimes she drowns, sometimes she burns, sometimes she is merely betrayed and discarded. The core remains, a woman wronged, refusing to vanish. But the specifics, as unstable as the shadows flickering across the paper lantern you hold. People debate these details endlessly, even during the parade. One old man insists Oiwa's story is proof of the dangers of vanity, a moral warning. Another argues she symbolizes injustice, the vengeance of the powerless. A third laughs and says the theater companies probably just exaggerated the makeup for dramatic effect, and you realize none of them are wrong. Ghosts in Edo weren't fossils of belief, preserved in amber. They were living myths, adaptable, reshaped for whatever the moment demanded. It isn't just the famous ones. Even the smaller yokai morph as they travel from storyteller to storyteller. That umbrella ghost? Sometimes it has one eye and one leg. Other times it hops with two, or sprouts a mischievous grin. The Rokurokubi? In some tales, her neck stretches. In others, her head detaches entirely and floats around like a balloon on a string. Historians still argue whether these contradictions were sloppy storytelling or a deliberate flexibility meant to keep the audience unsettled. You can almost hear the marketing machine of Edo grinding behind these tales. Publishers churned out illustrated books called Yokai Emaki, scrolls of monsters with little captions. Kabuki actors donned grotesque masks, swishing their sleeves like floating spirits. Artists exaggerated features for shock value, longer tongues, bigger eyes, creepier smiles. And yet, villagers outside the city often clung to quieter, humbler versions, spirits as warnings not to stay out too late, or as explanations for why the rice crop had failed. Same creature, two personalities. Which one was true? That was never the point. The Lantern Parade itself plays into this uncertainty. No one here tonight seems bothered by inconsistency. If one person swears they saw a Noparabo by the river and another says she had lips but no eyes, both versions are accepted. It's almost as if the slipperiness itself is the point, that fear works best when it has no solid shape. You can't fight what keeps changing. And then there are the stories where you feel the lines between yokai, ghost, and human dissolving completely. A drunk merchant nearby is telling the children about the shirime, a creature whose sole feature is an eye where its, well, let's just say its backside should be. Everyone bursts out laughing, of course, but the story has lingered for centuries. Was it comedy, a satire of pompous officials, or just proof that even Edo's nightmares needed comic relief? Scholars still argue whether the shirimi belongs in the same class as more serious yokai, or whether it was simply bathroom humor preserved for posterity. Either way, it leaves you squirming, though not from fear. You notice something clever in the way the crowd responds to each story. When the tales lean dark, people clutch their lanterns tighter, their voices dipping to whispers. When the tales become absurd, they laugh loud enough to chase the unease away. The folklore isn't just being told, it's being managed, adjusted in real time to keep the balance between fright and fun. You think back to modern horror movies, where everyone nervously giggles in the theater, waiting for the next jump scare. Edo's Lantern Parade feels like a live version of that, long before cinemas existed. But the most haunting thought comes when you realize the city itself is shaping these yokai, bending them to its needs. Edo was crowded, smoky, buzzing with commerce. It needed entertainment, moral lessons, distractions, and sometimes just excuses for why things went wrong. Fire broke out? Perhaps a fire spirit? A sudden death? Maybe an angry ghost? A missing sandal? Surely a trickster yokai hopped away with it. The supernatural became a flexible tool, plugged into whatever gaps reality left open. And you, walking in this shifting cloud of story and smoke, start to feel the instability seep into your own perception. You glance at a paper lantern hanging from a shop sign, and for a second, you swear its painted face has changed expression. You blink, back to normal. Did you imagine it, or has the story infected your sight? You'll never know. One last tale drifts over the crowd before the drums ahead call everyone to hush. It's about a woman seen walking by moonlight, her hair long and streaming. Some say she is a yurei. Others say she is a kitsune, a fox spirit in disguise. Still others insist she is simply a beautiful courtesan heading home late. Which is correct? The answer depends on who is telling the story, and perhaps that is Edo's greatest magic. Truth and fiction are lantern flames, bending in the night air, never still long enough to pin down. Historians still argue whether these tales were rooted in real encounters with traveling monks or tall foreigners who unsettled locals. Others suggest the stories sprang from natural phenomena, fog that thickens as you notice it, shadows that grow monstrous in lamplight. But let's be honest, I saw a giant monk who kept expanding makes for a way better fireside tale than the weather was weird. There's also a quirky tidbit in how the Onyudo got tied to animals. Some versions describe it as a transformed badger or raccoon dog, a tanuki playing tricks by magnifying its size. Imagine a mischievous animal so dedicated to the bit that it pretends to be a terrifying giant monk. It's the supernatural version of a kid standing on another kid's shoulders in an oversized trench coat. Absurd and unsettling in equal measure. The performers in the parade embrace that absurdity. The giant lantern lurches forward, its single eye glowing with an orange flame. Every so often, one of the carriers tips it just enough that it leans toward the crowd, making children squeal and adults step back nervously. Someone beside you mutters that if you keep looking at it, your soul will be swallowed. You look away, then peek back, because self-preservation is one thing, but curiosity always wins. In the Edo period, storytellers used the Onyudo to remind people about the dangers of obsession. Fixating on what frightens you, they said, gives it power. That lesson hasn't aged a day. You've probably had nights where you can't stop staring at the weird shape in the corner of your bedroom, convinced it's moving, until it fills your entire brain like the Onyudo filling the sky. And then, of course, you discover it's just a jacket on a chair. Or at least you hope it is. One account from the 1600s describes villagers in Shinano province reporting a giant figure rising above the mist near a temple, so tall its head scraped the clouds. Priests performed rituals, farmers offered food, but the figure only faded after several nights. Was it a weather quirk, a collective hallucination, or maybe, as skeptics later suggested, an especially tall bonfire misinterpreted in the fog? Historians still argue whether this was folklore in the making or a real mass sighting event. Meanwhile, Edo artists couldn't resist exaggerating the monster. Woodblock prints often showed the Onyudo looming above terrified townsfolk, with faces peeking from windows like little dolls beneath his robes. But in some cheekier prints, the artist gave the giant comically wide sleeves and a faintly bored expression, as though being impossibly huge was more tiresome than terrifying. You can almost hear him sigh. Yes, yes, I'm enormous. Can we move on? Back in the parade, the great lantern finally stops in the center of the square. The carriers chant, their voices low and rhythmic, while drummers strike a slow beat to match the groaning sway of the giant figure. It's theatrical, yes, but it has that uncanny edge, the kind where performance and belief blur until you're not sure whether everyone is pretending or if someone out there really expects the Onudo to appear tonight. A breeze shifts, and the lantern's flame flickers dangerously. For a moment, the single painted eye seems alive, darting across the crowd. You catch yourself staring too long. The performers tilt it again, and the eye grows wider, larger, almost too large for the fabric to contain. You shake your head quickly, tearing your gaze away. That's the lesson, after all. Don't let your fear fill the frame. Still, as the parade moves on and the lantern recedes into the distance, you can't help looking back one more time, just to check whether it really looks smaller now, or if, impossibly, it's still growing, even as it vanishes into the night. The hush settles over the parade like a heavy blanket, as if the very air has decided to press down on your shoulders. The drums quiet, the flute notes linger just a moment longer, and all the lanterns seem to pause mid-sway. That's when you hear it, soft footsteps that do not match the rhythm of the crowd. You glance to your left, then to your right. Nothing. Yet the sound persists, slipping in and out of the parade's murmurs. Welcome to the unnerving presence of Edo's faceless spirits, the Nopperabo. The stories about them are deceptively simple. A person walking alone at night meets a stranger. The stranger might look perfectly normal, even familiar. A friend, a neighbor, a traveler asking for directions. Then the lantern light shifts, and their features melt away, leaving only smooth, pale skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. That blankness is what makes the Nopperabo so disturbing. Not monstrous, not bloody, just empty. You picture it now, turning to greet someone only to see your own reflection wiped clean. No expression, no recognition, just absence. People in Edo whispered about these encounters near riversides, temple roads, or quiet alleys. Historians still argue whether the Nopperabo was a unique ghostly category or simply a variation on older shapeshifter myths, especially the fox spirits known for disguises. Either way, the thought of a human-shaped void brushing past you at night was enough to keep even the bravest merchant clutching his lantern tighter. The creepiest part? Sometimes the faceless one wasn't a stranger. Sometimes, according to the stories, it was your spouse, your child, or even your own reflection in a basin of water. Imagine washing your face at dawn, only to look down and find smooth blankness gazing back. One Edo diarist claimed he dreamed this repeatedly, and neighbors teased him for weeks, saying maybe he was destined to become faceless himself. Whether that was superstition or just mean-spirited gossip, no one can say. The blank face had a cultural sting in Edo's society. This was a world obsessed with appearances, class markers in clothing, careful etiquette in expressions, theatrical makeup in kabuki. To strip all that away was to strip identity itself. No wonder the Nopperabo struck a nerve. One woodblock print from the late 1700s shows a terrified samurai dropping his sword as the woman he's courting turns faceless before him. Was the lesson about vanity in love? About being cautious at night? Or was it just a cheap thrill for readers? Historians still argue whether these prints were moral allegories or just pulp horror. There's even a quirky tidbit about how the faceless spirit crossed oceans. Early 20th century collectors in the West sometimes mislabeled Nopperabo as faceless demons and slotted them alongside Greek gorgons and Celtic banshees in their notes, as if all ghost stories belonged to one big spooky family tree. It's funny in hindsight, but it shows how universal that fear is, the terror of looking into a human face and finding nothing there. The parade around you leans into this theme without saying the name. You notice a group of young performers carrying masks that are featureless white ovals, like unfinished clay heads. They walk slowly, silently, unnerving even the rowdy kids who had been laughing minutes ago. A woman nearby whispers that staring at these masks too long will make your own features vanish in the mirror tonight. You roll your eyes, but still, you find yourself glancing at the ground instead of their blank faces, just in case. The parade carries you further, though your thoughts still linger on the faceless ones. Every flicker of lantern light seems to distort the features of passers-by, just for a second, just long enough to make you question your eyes. Then, as if to cleanse that unease, a different sound rises. A creaking, groaning noise that seems impossibly heavy for a festival street. You soon see why. Up ahead, 4 men are hauling something massive through the crowd. It isn't a float, at least not in the cheerful sense. It's a gigantic lantern painted to resemble a monster with a single bulging eye. The lantern rocks with each step, casting warped shadows across the houses and onto the street. You recognize the figure, the Onyudo, or giant priest. This yokai has a peculiar history. In the simplest description, it's a towering, human-like figure, often wearing priestly robes, who grows larger and larger the longer you stare at it. Think of it as the original "don't feed the troll" rule, except here, the more attention you give it, the more it swells, sometimes blotting out the sky. People in Edo believed it could be seen on lonely roads or looming over riverbanks. And unlike the faceless spirit, this one didn't just vanish politely. The Onyudo was rumored to bring illness, paralysis, or even sudden death to those who couldn't look away. Historians still argue whether these tales were rooted in real encounters with traveling monks or tall foreigners who unsettled locals. Others suggest the stories sprang from natural phenomena, fog that thickens as you notice it, shadows that grow monstrous in lamplight. But let's be honest, I saw a giant monk who kept expanding makes for a way better fireside tale than the weather was weird. There's also a quirky tidbit in how the Onyudo got tied to animals. Some versions describe it as a transformed badger or raccoon dog, a tanuki playing tricks by magnifying its size. Imagine a mischievous animal so dedicated to the bit that it pretends to be a terrifying giant monk. It's the supernatural version of a kid standing on another kid's shoulders in an oversized trench coat. Absurd and unsettling in equal measure. The performers in the parade embrace that absurdity. The giant lantern lurches forward, its single eye glowing with an orange flame. Every so often, one of the carriers tips it just enough that it leans toward the crowd, making children squeal and adults step back nervously. Someone beside you mutters that if you keep looking at it, your soul will be swallowed. You look away, then peek back, because self-preservation is one thing, but curiosity always wins. In the Edo period, storytellers used the Onyudo to remind people about the dangers of obsession. Fixating on what frightens you, they said, gives it power. That lesson hasn't aged a day. You've probably had nights where you can't stop staring at the weird shape in the corner of your bedroom, convinced it's moving, until it fills your entire brain like the Onyudo filling the sky. And then, of course, you discover it's just a jacket on a chair, or at least you hope it is. One account from the 1600s describes villagers in Shinano province reporting a giant figure rising above the mist near a temple, so tall its head scraped the clouds. Priests performed rituals, farmers offered food, but the figure only faded after several nights. Was it a weather quirk, a collective hallucination, or maybe, as skeptics later suggested, an especially tall bonfire misinterpreted in the fog? Historians still argue whether this was folklore in the making or a real mass sighting event. Meanwhile, Edo artists couldn't resist exaggerating the monster. Woodblock prints often showed the Onyudo looming above terrified townsfolk, with faces peeking from windows like little dolls beneath his robes. But in some cheekier prints, the artist gave the giant comically wide sleeves and a faintly bored expression, as though being impossibly huge was more tiresome than terrifying. You can almost hear him sigh, "Yes, yes, I'm enormous. Can we move on?" Back in the parade, the great lantern finally stops in the center of the square. The carriers chant, their voices low and rhythmic, while drummers strike a slow beat to match the groaning sway of the giant figure. It's theatrical, yes, but it has that uncanny edge, the kind where performance and belief blur until you're not sure whether everyone is pretending or if someone out there really expects the Onyudo to appear tonight. A breeze shifts, and the lantern's flame flickers dangerously. For a moment, the single painted eye seems alive, darting across the crowd. You catch yourself staring too long. The performers tilt it again, and the eye grows wider, larger, almost too large for the fabric to contain. You shake your head quickly, tearing your gaze away. That's the lesson, after all. Don't let your fear fill the frame. Still, as the parade moves on and the lantern recedes into the distance, you can't help looking back one more time, just to check whether it really looks smaller now, or if, impossibly, it's still growing, even as it vanishes into the night. The parade carries you further, though your thoughts still linger on the faceless ones. Every flicker of lantern light seems to distort the features of passers-by, just for a second, just long enough to make you question your eyes. Then, as if to cleanse that unease, a different sound rises, a creaking, groaning noise that seems impossibly heavy for a festival street. You soon see why. Up ahead, 4 men are hauling something massive through the crowd. It isn't a float, at least not in the cheerful sense. It's a gigantic lantern, painted to resemble a monster, with a single, bulging eye. The lantern rocks with each step, casting warped shadows across the houses and onto the street. You recognize the figure, the Onyudo, or giant priest. This yokai has a peculiar history. In the simplest description, it's a towering, human-like figure, often wearing priestly robes, who grows larger and larger the longer you stare at it. Think of it as the original "don't feed the troll" rule, except here, the more attention you give it, the more it swells, sometimes blotting out the sky. People in Edo believed it could be seen on lonely roads or looming over riverbanks. And unlike the faceless spirit, this one didn't just vanish politely. The Onyudo was rumored to bring illness, paralysis, or even sudden death to those who couldn't look away. Historians still argue whether these tales were rooted in real encounters with traveling monks or tall foreigners who unsettled locals. Others suggest the stories sprang from natural phenomena, fog that thickens as you notice it, shadows that grow monstrous in lamplight. But let's be honest, I saw a giant monk who kept expanding makes for a way better fireside tale than "the weather was weird." There's also a quirky tidbit in how the Onyudo got tied to animals. Some versions describe it as a transformed badger or raccoon dog, a tanuki playing tricks by magnifying its size. Imagine a mischievous animal so dedicated to the bit that it pretends to be a terrifying giant monk. It's the supernatural version of a kid standing on another kid's shoulders in an oversized trench coat. Absurd and unsettling in equal measure. The performers in the parade embrace that absurdity. The giant lantern lurches forward, its single eye glowing with an orange flame. Every so often, one of the carriers tips it just enough that it leans toward the crowd, making children squeal and adults step back nervously. Someone beside you mutters that if you keep looking at it, your soul will be swallowed. You look away, then peek back, because self-preservation is one thing, but curiosity always wins. In the Edo period, storytellers used the Onyudo to remind people about the dangers of obsession. Fixating on what frightens you, they said, gives it power. That lesson hasn't aged a day. You've probably had nights where you can't stop staring at the weird shape in the corner of your bedroom, convinced it's moving, until it fills your entire brain like the Onyudo filling the sky. And then, of course, you discover it's just a jacket on a chair, or at least you hope it is. One account from the 1600s describes villagers in Shinano province reporting a giant figure rising above the mist near a temple, so tall its head scraped the clouds. Priests performed rituals, farmers offered food, but the figure only faded after several nights. Was it a weather quirk, a collective hallucination? Or maybe, as skeptics later suggested, an especially tall bonfire misinterpreted in the fog? Historians still argue whether this was folklore in the making or a real mass sighting event. Meanwhile, Edo artists couldn't resist exaggerating the monster. Woodblock prints often showed the Onyudo looming above terrified townsfolk, with faces peeking from windows like little dolls beneath his robes. But in some cheekier prints, the artist gave the giant comically wide sleeves and a faintly bored expression, as though being impossibly huge was more tiresome than terrifying. You can almost hear him sigh. Yes, I'm enormous. Can we move on? Back in the parade, the great lantern finally stops in the center of the square. The carriers chant, their voices low and rhythmic, while drummers strike a slow beat to match the groaning sway of the giant figure. It's theatrical, yes, but it has that uncanny edge, the kind where performance and belief blur until you're not sure whether everyone is pretending or if someone out there really expects the Onudo to appear tonight. A breeze shifts, and the lantern's flame flickers dangerously. For a moment, the single painted eye seems alive, darting across the crowd. You catch yourself staring too long. The performers tilt it again, and the eye grows wider, larger, almost too large for the fabric to contain. You shake your head quickly, tearing your gaze away. That's the lesson, after all. Don't let your fear fill the frame. Still, as the parade moves on and the lantern recedes into the distance, you can't help looking back one more time, just to check whether it really looks smaller now, or if, impossibly, it's still growing, even as it vanishes into the night. You walk on, the crowd pressing and shifting around you, and the lingering image of that giant one-eyed lantern fades only when a new sound rises. A high, strange laughter. Not the belly laugh of someone drunk on festival's sake, but a rapid, repetitive cackle, almost like someone deliberately imitating a child's giggle. It rolls down the street in bursts, making people turn their heads, half amused, half unnerved. Then you see it. A small troupe of masked dancers twirling around with paper lanterns, shaped like disembodied heads. The faces are painted with broad grins, the kind that stay fixed no matter what angle you view them from. These performers are here to represent the Okikumushi and Noparabo's cousins, but really, they're channeling something older and stranger, the laughter of Hyaki Yagyo, the night parade of 100 demons. Edo residents believed that when yokai gathered en masse, the air itself would change. Dogs would bark wildly, lantern flames sputter, and laughter without a source, would echo through the alleys. Historians still argue whether this phantom laughter was a metaphor for collective hysteria, or if it was just people freaking each other out on summer nights when shadows grew long and nerves wore thin. But the dancers aren't just cackling for effect. Between the laughs, they pause to tell quick rhymes in a sing-song tone, little couplets meant to invite the spirits closer. One verse warns that if you follow the sound of laughter too far, you'll vanish into the yokai parade itself, never to return. Another says that if you laugh back at the phantom, the spirit might cling to you for a year, chuckling just out of earshot, a ghostly roommate you never asked for. The quirky part. Edo guidebooks sometimes treated these creepy traditions as tourist attractions. Imagine flipping through a glossy travel pamphlet that says, "Come visit Edo, fine tea houses, kabuki theater, and also uncontrollable laughter that may or may not drive you mad." A little unsettling, but also very on brand for a city that thrived on mixing entertainment with a brush of the eerie. You notice a child tugging at her mother's sleeve, asking why the dancers keep turning their lanterns upside down. The answer slips from a nearby storyteller. Upside-down lanterns were a known omen, a sign that spirits were near. A normal flame burns upward. If it seems to burn downward, well, that meant gravity itself might be bending to accommodate the yokai. It's like the universe setting mood lighting for its favorite monsters. And the laughter grows louder. The troupe circles tighter, their shrill giggles cutting through the drum beats, bouncing off the wooden facades of tea houses. You catch yourself chuckling once, just a little, and instantly regret it. A man beside you murmurs that you shouldn't laugh along. You'll only encourage the spirits. You try to keep a straight face, which of course makes you want to laugh more. It's the supernatural version of being told not to giggle in class, and suddenly it's the only thing you can think about. Historians still argue whether these eerie performances were satire too, hidden jokes about officials or public figures. After all, laughter is one of the safest disguises for criticism. If someone asked why you were imitating a certain governor's walk or laugh, you could shrug and say, "Oh no, it's just a demon." It's plausible deniability in its purest form. The performers twirl faster now, their lanterns swinging like disembodied heads, their cackles melting into one another, until it feels like the entire street is laughing at you, at all of you, for even daring to take this parade seriously. The air gets warmer, the crowd squeezes tighter, and you wonder, is this just theater, or is the yokai parade really pressing closer tonight, using these human voices as camouflage? A quirky anecdote survives from a merchant's diary in 1780. He wrote that during a lantern festival, the laughter grew so loud he was sure the demons themselves had joined in. Yet, when he turned to leave, he found his sandals nailed to the ground by an unseen force. He swore he stood there, frozen, while the crowd moved past him, until the laughter finally ebbed. Later, he discovered the soles of his sandals were untouched. Historians still argue whether this was a metaphor for stage fright, or an early description of sleep paralysis, misinterpreted through yokai lore. In the present parade, you press forward, relieved as the laughter begins to thin out, replaced once more by the steady beat of drums and the softer, calmer hum of festival chatter. But even as the dancers vanish into another street, you can't quite shake the echo of it. That thin, eerie laughter still seems to rattle in your chest, as though some small part of it decided to tag along with you. The drums soften into something slower, more deliberate, and the lantern glow takes on a warmer hue as you drift toward a quarter of Edo that feels strangely different. The streets here are wider, the noise mellower, and silk banners hang from balconies in elegant arcs. You've stumbled into the ukiyo, the floating world, the famed pleasure quarters where theater, tea houses, and other entertainments blur daydream with night. Here, lanterns do not merely chase away shadows, they seduce them. Their paper shades are painted not with yokai faces or grotesque creatures, but with flowers, birds, flowing calligraphy, and the names of courtesans written in bold brushstrokes. The light is softer, golden, deliberately flattering. You can almost imagine your own reflection improved by it, like stepping through an Instagram filter centuries before its time. But even here, where elegance and indulgence are supposed to reign, ghost stories slip in like uninvited guests. Courtesans would whisper them to clients late at night, when lantern flames grew low and voices softened to near whispers. Imagine paying a small fortune for wine, companionship, and poetry, only to spend half the evening clutching your sleeve while someone tells you about a headless woman wandering the garden. Apparently, Edo's wealthy love to mix their luxuries with chills down the spine. One of the most famous tales in these quarters was of the ubum, a spirit of a woman who died in childbirth. She would approach lantern-lit doorways, cradling a swaddled baby, asking passers-by to hold it for just a moment. If you accepted, the bundle grew heavier and heavier until it turned into a stone, or worse, a sodden corpse. Historians still argue whether this story was meant as a moral tale about neglect, or simply a horrifying way to pass the time when business was slow. Either way, it became a staple of floating world ghost lore, whispered in the same rooms where haiku were composed and shamisen strummed. You pause outside a tea house where shadows ripple on the sliding paper doors. Inside, you glimpse a group of patrons circled around a storyteller who balances a lantern in front of his face, making his features loom and stretch. He leans forward as if confiding in the whole room at once, telling of the rokurokubi, women whose necks could extend in the night, twisting serpent-like to drink the oil from lamps or peek into dreams. The men laugh nervously, but none of them glance too long at the courtesans by their side, perhaps wondering if the soft glow on their faces might conceal a hidden stretch of sinew waiting for midnight. The quirky part? Some Edo guide scrolls actually listed which courtesans were famous for telling the best ghost stories, almost like Yelp reviews. Imagine the write-up. Lovely singing voice, elegant manners, and truly bone-chilling tales of faceless monks. 5 stars would get haunted again. Even the architecture joined in on the ambience. Pleasure houses often used colored lanterns, red, pink, or violet, that distorted the natural complexion of their guests. Under that glow, the line between the living and the spectral blurred. Were you looking at a beautiful woman or a ghostly illusion, painted in rouge and candle smoke? Historians still argue whether these color choices were deliberate attempts to heighten the dreamlike quality of the floating world, or just fashion trends that happen to feel supernatural. And then there's fire. Always fire. The entire district, like the rest of Edo, was built from wood and paper. Lanterns gave warmth and mystery, yes, but they were also constant hazards. There are accounts of courtesans fleeing in elaborate robes, their hems catching sparks as lanterns toppled. A single mishap could erase a whole row of tea houses. Perhaps that's why ghost stories flourished here, when reality itself was so fragile, so combustible. Tales of fleeting spirits felt entirely appropriate. You step back into the street, the fragrance of incense mingling with the distant sharpness of grilled eel. A geisha passes, her lantern painted with a chrysanthemum, and you watch as the flame inside briefly flickers against her face, almost masking her eyes in shadow. For a heartbeat, she looks like one of those faceless Naparabo you heard about earlier. She notices your gaze, smiles just slightly, and continues on. Was it just the play of light? Or did the floating world slip its mask for an instant? The pleasure quarter hums with contradictions. Beauty, melancholy, indulgence, and death all bound together in one lantern glow. You realize the floating world's greatest trick wasn't wine or theater or company. It was the way it made you feel, that you'd stepped into a dream so vivid that you couldn't tell whether the phantoms whispering in the corners were part of the show or part of you. The floating world fades behind you as the streets grow quieter, but the glow of lanterns still follows, little orbs bobbing like watchful eyes. You begin to notice something you hadn't thought much about before. Every lantern is, at its heart, a controlled flame, a tiny fire tucked into paper. You can almost hear the city holding its breath with every flicker. Edo was not just the city of lanterns, it was also the city of fires. The place burned so often that people grimly joked about the blossoms of Edo, not cherry blossoms, but firestorms rising in plumes of smoke. Wooden houses crammed shoulder to shoulder, paper screens, straw mats, lacquered furniture. Every detail of daily life was basically kindling. A dropped lantern or careless puff of wind could turn an evening's warmth into a citywide disaster. As you walk, you see bucket brigades stationed at intervals, night watchmen clanging wooden clappers to remind residents not to let flames run wild. Imagine trying to sleep while someone outside rhythmically clicks wood together like a strangely passive-aggressive neighbor. But the people of Edo tolerated it. The sound was reassurance that someone was watching, someone was awake, while everyone else drifted off. The strange irony is that despite the danger, lanterns kept multiplying. Festivals, shopfronts, parades, Edo couldn't resist the allure of light. Historians still argue whether this obsession was sheer stubbornness, a refusal to let fear of fire snuff out joy, or whether it was more practical. Lanterns were simply too useful to abandon, guiding people through dark streets that had no electric lamps, no neon, no glow of smartphones in the night. One quirky tidbit you stumble across: some residents actually used lantern charms against fire itself. These charms might be small paper slips blessed at temples, or strange little talismanic doodles pinned near doors, meant to calm the fire gods. There's something deeply funny about the idea, warding off fire, with more paper. But in a city where fire brigades had as much celebrity status as kabuki actors, you take every little comfort you can. The fire brigades, by the way, were almost theatrical in themselves. Dressed in matching coats, carrying elaborate poles, they would rush through the streets like teams of superheroes. Crowds sometimes gathered to cheer them on, which feels like something out of a sports arena. Imagine watching your block nearly burned down and still finding time to rate the firefighters' dramatic style. But this is Edo, danger and performance constantly intertwined. You picture a ghost story told by some weary merchant, a lantern that refused to go out, no matter how hard you tried. Blown on, doused with water, even smashed apart, and yet the flame lingered, pale blue and whispering. Some said such flames were yokai in disguise, feeding on human carelessness. Others swore they were the spirits of those lost in earlier fires, forever reminding the living of what it meant to be consumed too quickly. One of the eeriest parts of this walk is realizing how fragile the city must have felt. Every time someone set a lantern on a festival float, they knew the beauty carried danger. It's almost like watching fireworks today. You marvel at the sparks, even as you think, if this goes wrong, well, we're all on the news. There's a gentle joke among Edo diarists, though. Some complained that fires were at least a great excuse to socialize. Neighbors who barely spoke might suddenly be standing side by side at midnight, hauling buckets, gossiping between frantic splashes. Community by catastrophe, in other words. It's almost charming, in a dark way, how humans bond while trying not to let their houses burn down. You stop before a shrine where lanterns glow in neat lines, each one donated by townsfolk. The air is heavy with incense, and the flames here seem steadier, calmer, as if the gods themselves cup their hands around them. For a moment, You feel both awe and unease, because here, unlike the floating world, there is no performance, no distraction, just the raw truth that every flame is temporary and every light can betray you. As you step back into the night, the sound of a distant drum reminds you that life went on regardless. People still painted paper lanterns, still bought them at markets, still set them out on their porches. Fire might have been the city's constant enemy, but the glow was also its heartbeat. And maybe that was the most haunting fact of all, that Edo chose to live brightly, even knowing it was always one spark away from vanishing into ash. You drift further into the quieter quarters now, away from the shrines and the loud clatter of the night watch. Here, the lantern glow softens. You find yourself near small gatherings of scholars, philosophers, and curious amateurs. People who stayed up late not to drink or gamble, but to argue about what, exactly, all these yokai and ghostly lanterns meant. In Edo, scholarship wasn't just dry scrolls and dusty libraries. It often spilled into tea houses, where men with ink-stained fingers would lean over steaming cups and whisper about whether yokai were real, symbolic, or just the result of too much rice wine. Some insisted these creatures embodied moral lessons, warnings against greed, laziness, or straying into the wrong neighborhoods. Others countered that yokai were natural phenomena misinterpreted, lantern light refracting in fog, or the shriek of owls mistaken for spirits. Historians still argue whether this intellectual curiosity was widespread or limited to elite circles, but you imagine it both ways. Samurai scribbling thoughtful essays while ordinary townsfolk listen nearby, adding their own quips. It's the classic scenario. One person delivers a grand theory about metaphysics, and someone else interrupts to point out that their neighbor's cat has been suspiciously human-shaped in candlelight. One quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some scholars actually published yokai encyclopedias. These were lavishly illustrated books, cataloging every odd creature and ghost said to haunt Japan, kind of like Pokemon guides centuries before Game Boys. Flip through one, and you'd see long-tongued monsters, umbrella demons hopping about on single legs, or lantern spirits with grotesque faces. Were these scientific records? In a way, yes. But they were also entertainment, and people collected them the way you might today collect conspiracy theories or cryptid sightings. As you lean into this circle of late-night chatter, you catch one debate that almost sounds modern. Is belief in yokai dangerous nonsense or harmless fun? One scholar worries that scaring children with ghost stories might corrupt their ability to think rationally. Another smirks and replies that children need a little fright in their lives. Otherwise, they'll grow up dull and too trusting of the world. You quietly agree. After all, nothing keeps you more alert at night than the possibility of a one-eyed lantern spirit floating into your bedroom. The tone shifts as the scholars dive into moral territory. Some argue yokai tales were not about monsters at all, but thinly veiled critiques of society, parables about corrupt officials, greedy merchants, or the folly of excessive luxury. Others shake their heads and mutter that people just like to scare each other. You've seen this kind of divide before. The folks who insist every horror movie is secretly social commentary, and the ones who just want to jump when the monster leaps out. One of the more amusing stories floating in these circles is about skeptics who got spooked despite themselves. A well-known samurai scholar once claimed yokai were nonsense, until he was walking home one misty night, saw a lantern glow bobbing through the fog, and ran all the way back to his estate. Turned out, it was just a neighbor carrying groceries. Still, it's comforting to know that even the smartest minds of Edo had moments of panicked overreaction. And you can't help but think, maybe that was the whole point. Lantern parades, yokai stories, ghostly whispers. They gave people a shared stage to wrestle with life's mysteries. Whether or not anyone truly believed in yokai mattered less than the fact that everyone had a story about them. A citywide bedtime story in a way, retold in every tea house and alley. As you leave the scholarly circle, you glance back at the small lanterns glowing over their table. They don't look so different from the lanterns you saw in the pleasure quarters or the ones carried in parades. They're all fragile paper and flame, fragile symbols glowing against the night. And perhaps, you think, that's why the scholars never reached agreement. Because yokai weren't meant to be solved like math problems. They were meant to flicker in the space between belief and doubt, like lanterns in fog, half seen, always just out of reach. The night has been long, and yet it doesn't feel tiring. The soft shuffle of gaita sandals on cobblestones has become a rhythm under your steps, steady and almost hypnotic. You notice now how the lanterns, once blazing in thick clusters, are beginning to thin. Their glow grows weaker, the paper shades dimmed by the oil sputtering low. You follow the last great procession as it winds its way down a quiet avenue. The air smells faintly of ash and cooling metal, a sign that the stalls are folding up, the fires snuffed one by one. You drift alongside townsfolk, some yawning, others still whispering their favorite ghost story from the night. A child clutches a miniature lantern, holding it proudly, though the flame inside has already gone out. His parents don't scold him. They let him carry the empty shell, a symbol of belonging to the great night parade. You smile at the detail, thinking about how memory often glows longer than fire itself. Historians still argue whether these nightly parades were meant more for protection, for entertainment, or simply to stretch out the summer hours. Some records describe them as religious observances, others as excuses to socialize late into the night. You suspect both are true. Human beings are endlessly good at weaving sacred and ordinary together, saying a prayer while also checking who has the best grilled squid on a stick. The quirky detail that catches your imagination tonight is how people sometimes claimed that the lanterns themselves were alive. Not just tools, but vessels with moods, happy, sad, even mischievous. A cracked lantern might mean misfortune. A lantern that stayed lit despite rain could mean a blessing. And if one suddenly went out, people sometimes whispered it wasn't the wind at all, but a yokai snuffing it with invisible fingers. You glance nervously at the nearest one, half hoping it doesn't wink out right as you pass. The procession turns toward a bridge. Lanterns reflect in the river, doubling their number, trembling on the black water. For a moment, it almost looks like a second parade marches beneath you, an upside-down echo that will never reach the shore. Some say that's where the yokai live, in the reflection, in the version of the world you can't quite touch. Others claim it's just water and firelight. You decide it's both, because it's more soothing that way. Step by step, the group disperses. Some take shortcuts into alleys, others vanish into doorways. The clamor of drums has ended, and even the storytellers have packed away their props. One lantern bearer pauses to relight his flame, shielding it carefully with cupped hands before disappearing around a corner. You realize that, in another hour, the city will look ordinary again, just a sprawl of wood and tile, waiting for the business of morning. But you've seen its other face, the flickering one, painted in shadow and rumor. And here you are, at the very last stretch. A single line of lanterns trails into the distance, swaying gently, their light paling against the pale streaks of dawn, now brushing the horizon. The sky shifts from black to soft gray, and suddenly, the lanterns look fragile, almost embarrassed to still be burning. They sputter one by one, paper curling slightly from the damp air. The yokai you half suspected were following you seem to melt away, retreating into the folds of memory where they belong. The sun creeps higher, dissolving the final traces of the night parade. What remains is the hush of morning, a silence so complete it feels as though the city itself is holding its breath. You stand there, watching the very last lantern fade into brightness, and you know the night's enchantment is gone, but not wasted. Like every story told and every fear half believed, it lingers. You carry it with you, tucked away, ready to glow again the next time night falls. And now, as the lanterns fade and the yokai retreat, you allow your own breath to soften. Let the rhythm of walking, of sandals on cobblestone, slow into stillness. The parades have ended, the stories are whispered into silence, and the city of Edo rests once more under morning light. Your mind may still hum with lantern glow and ghostly shadows, but let those images drift like smoke, thin, harmless, dissolving in the air. Each flicker you imagined, each shadow you thought you saw at the edge of the night, becomes nothing more than a gentle dream. The scholars can debate, the merchants can whisper, and the children can carry their empty lanterns, but you can finally close your eyes. The hum of the fan in your room replaces the drums of the festival. The faint glow of your screen or lamp is its own kind of lantern, soft and steady. And outside, wherever you are, night continues, not with parades and yokai, but with quiet stars, patient and watchful. So you let your body sink deeper, as if walking no longer, but floating. The wooden streets, the misty bridges, the laughter of storytellers, all of it drifts away, leaving only calm. Imagine your own lantern, small but warm, glowing gently beside you. No fear in its light, no trick of the shadows, just comfort. And with that, the story closes. Edo returns to history. You return to rest. Sweet dreams.